Today I'm going to be talking about landing pages and layouts in Drupal. And I kind of call this the paragraphs versus layout builder edition. I've given a talk like this before, talking about different techniques for building landing pages. And now that layout builder is on the scene, there's always new things to talk about. So for those of you who I haven't met before, my name's Suzanne Dergacheva. I'm one of the co-founders of Evolving Web. We're a Drupal agency. And we also run a training program. So I love teaching Drupal. It's part of my job, one of my favorite parts of my job. I've also been on the Drupal Association as a board member for the last couple years, so I'm pretty involved in the community and always like to talk about community stuff. I run the Promote Drupal initiative, or help run the Promote Drupal initiative. So if you are at all interested in marketing for Drupal, I'd also love to talk to you about that. And if you want to reach out to me, I'm pixelite on the Drupal Slack. I'm Suzanne_Kennedy on Twitter, and I also have my email address there. You can email me, suzanne@evolvingweb.ca. So you can email me with questions afterwards. I'd love to hear from you. So one of the key things that I think is important to focus on when we're talking about building landing pages and layouts in Drupal is the content editor experience. And I like to focus on this because I think it's something that we sometimes forget in Drupal. A lot of us here today are probably developers, we're site builders, maybe we're front-end developers or themers, and we probably have more familiarity with the Drupal backend than we realize with the Drupal admin UI. And it's important to realize that when you're creating a Drupal website, because Drupal is so flexible, what we're actually creating is also a tool for content editors. And the success of the website, the actual communication goals or business goals of the website are only going to be met if the content editors can really do their job and if they can actually create meaningful content. And so I talk about that because I think it's something that we just sometimes slips our mind. It's not top of mind necessarily when we're building a website or planning a website. And so when I do user experience workshops and things like that, I always try and include content editors as one of the audiences that we design for. And why is that relevant for this topic? Why is that relevant for today? Because we're talking about tools for building landing pages and layouts in Drupal. And those are tools that content editors are going to find really useful. So it's important to consider this when we start planning out any project. What do the content editors actually want to be able to do? And sometimes we get some hints of this in the design phase. So I don't know about you, but I work with some very talented designers, and I work with lots of different types of designers. Some of them know Drupal really well, some of them don't. And often, actually this design's from a couple years ago. So starting a couple years ago, every design I would get would kind of start looking like this, like these really big images, lots and lots of stripes of content or swaths of content that kind of make up a page. And a lot of these things that I started to call landing pages. Sometimes we call them like marketing pages, pages with calls to action on them, but basically pages that don't really fall into the template of what we call content types in Drupal. Not something that you identify as a blog post or an event or a publication, but something a little bit more hard to put a finger on in terms of content. And so when we think about what content editors want, content editors also look at these designs. They also are involved in thinking about what kind of content do we want to put on the website, what's our strategy. They want to be able to create pages that look like this, pages that they're familiar with interacting with, and they want to be able to create them on the fly without having to go to a development team or work with a designer. And we, just a few more examples, like we get these types of designs, and as a developer, you can kind of maybe break this apart, and you might think, oh yeah, this part of the page, that looks like a view, or this part of the page is clearly, it's a programmatic block, or this is actually a node, like this is like what the node template would produce. But from a content editing perspective, they're not necessarily going to make those differentiations. Content editor might just think, yeah, I want to build a page. I want to create a page that's really visual, that looks like these types of designs that I see, or that looks like the websites I'm used to interacting with. And so it's important for us, from a site builder perspective or a developer perspective to anticipate that and to plan for that and to give tools that are going to result in interesting pages that also look consistent. So the design, in the designs, it's always very consistent. But once we actually get to a real life website, can a content editor actually take the content they want to publish and build something that looks coherent? And so I want to distinguish early on in our conversation today, what's the difference between page building and layout building? Because we have this tool now called the layout builder in Drupal, and that obviously gives us all this flexibility, or maybe you haven't seen it, but as you'll soon see, it gives us lots of flexibility. So, what is layout building and what is page building and what is the difference? So I make this difference because I think it's important to just our planning and to distinguish different tools that are necessary for each. And so when I think about layout building, I think about creating a layout that is like a template for my content. So if I have a recipe website, and this is obviously taken from the or if you're not familiar, this is taken from the umami theme for Drupal. So this is if I'm designing a page for a recipe and I want every recipe to look the same, I want all of my parameters about the recipe to be on the right, and I want my image for the recipe to be on the left. This is something that I can do, and I think of this as layout building. I think of this as being like templating for my content. Page building, on the other hand, I think of this as being when I want to create a new landing page, when I want to create a new page that's different than all my other pages. I want to actually design what that individual page is going to look like. And I also want to build up the content for it. So unlike the recipe example, I don't have a predefined set of fields, like every recipe has a cooking time. But in the case of my page building example, my landing page that I want to build, I have to decide what the content is. And then I also have to decide how that's going to appear on the page. And so I think this is a bit of a different use case. And this is something that we want to put into the hands of marketers, content editors, or just whoever is updating a website. We want to give them this tool. And so whatever approach you take to this second example, what you're designing in Drupal is actually a page building tool. And you can build a website just in static HTML where every landing page is built from scratch with HTML and CSS very lovingly. That's still a possibility. But typically what we want to do in Drupal is we want to design like a platform for publishing content. So we want to design something that others can use to build pages. And so I'm going to kind of walk through 2 examples here. And I have a little video actually. I hope this will play for us. And I want to look at this example, and I want to think about it from the perspective of planning out what kind of landing page building tool I need to create. So I just want you to look at the content on this page. which will hopefully load for us. Yes. Okay, so we're scrolling down the page. And what I see here, I think I'll show it again. It's pretty fast. It's pretty typical. It's one strip of content after the next, one kind of block of content after the next. And each element on the page, it's kind of self-contained, is its own thing. I see a big hero at the top. I see a listing of content afterwards. I see some calls to action, and I see one at a time. So each kind of stripe is a self-contained thing. And I think of this kind of landing page as being two-dimensional. And I know I'm just defining what two-dimensional means for my own purposes. So if you're, into math and you're going to say that's not two-dimensional, well, I say it's two-dimensional. So two-dimensional is like one dimension is, okay, we have the dimension of content where I'm deciding, okay, the first thing is a hero, the second thing is a view or an aggregate of 3 items or 3 entity references. And then the next thing is a call to action with an image on the left and some text and a link on the right. So we have deciding what the content is one dimension, and then deciding kind of like how the content is assembled on the page. I have the hero first, I have the call to action later on. This is a second dimension. So you might have a fairly simple structure like that, or you might have something that's more complicated. So I'm going to show you another example that I think is a slightly more advanced type of landing page. And this one's a little bit longer. There's a couple pages here, so I've got the video. So in this example, again, we have one thing after the next. We have some listings of content, social media feed, a set of probably taxonomy terms there. And then we have some examples where we have some content that's kind of side by side. And it's kind of right at the end there. So right at the end there, we had a form that was sitting right next to a call to action. And further up above, we had kind of a call to action sitting next to an image. And it could be that you want to be able to arbitrarily say, this piece of content is going to sit next to this other piece of content in the design. And those things, those elements of content, they're not really related, but or they're related in terms of my content strategy, but they're not related in terms of Drupal or in terms of the content model. I just decided that I wanted this thing to sit next to this thing. And that's adding a third dimension of complexity into my landing pages. So now I have the content, I have kind of where the content is going to go in terms of just ordering on the page, but I also have the layout of those elements and how they sit next to each other. So I have maybe 2 elements sitting side by side in a 2-column layout, or 3 elements sitting side by side in a 3-column layout. And I want the columns to be arranged just so, and I want the columns to be above or below other elements. And so I think this landing page is slightly more complex. And so there's this other component of flexibility. And it's a little bit subtle because it's possible to define one of these chunks of content, content component, we could call it, that has its own intrinsic kind of layout. Like you can have, you can design, let me just go back in my slides and maybe I can bring an example up on the page. We could define, we could define, for example, a hero, like this first hero, a lifetime of care that we see here, that actually has some settings in it. So we could say, oh, well, by default, the learn more link there is on the left, but maybe I have a setting where I can put that on the right. Or maybe I have a setting where I put the whole title, text, and link on the right, because maybe that's how, like the image that I want to use, it would work better that way. So you could have some layout aspects that are built into the settings of a content component without really having to manage a whole layout. And so what I'm getting at here is that not every single landing page needs the third dimension. You don't always need to have a layout that's complex like this. You could just have a layout where you're rearranging things in order from the top to the bottom of the page. And so how much complexity you have might determine what tool you need to use. And when we're talking about the layout builder versus paragraphs question, layout builder, as the name implies, has this layout dimension built into just how it's defined. Whereas if you're using a tool like paragraphs, it's not adept at managing a layout in the same way. And so before I jump into all the details of that and the pros and the cons, I want to think about this now from the content editor perspective. And I'm going to draw on some research I did with a colleague of mine as part of a UX study for Drupal to see how people use the layout builder. And in particular, this study compared the layout builder to paragraphs. And we also threw in, just for fun, a comparison with the WordPress Gutenberg project to see how people found these tools. And so what we did is we used the use case of page building. We created a script where we just asked people to create a landing page. We got some participants who had some Drupal experience, but who were kind of new to these tools. We recorded our tests and we looked at the results, and I'll just kind of share some of the findings with you. So what we did is the comparative aspect of this is that we were looking at how someone would build the same thing with different tools. And the first impressions people had of the layout builder, so from a content editor perspective, were kind of like, what does block mean? And where am I supposed to start? So when we look at the layout builder, it's designed primarily, and I think I can say this with some certainty, I think it's designed primarily for the layout building use case, which is if you're a site builder and you're designing a template for how your recipe is laid out, it's giving you all the tools to do that. And we can see that right here, where as soon as you go to sort of add some content into your layout, it's giving you these options for adding different fields. And it gets quite technical quite quick, like revision ID. So from a content editor perspective, it's a lot to take in. It's a lot of options. So you have these tools here, add section, add block. And so just at first, it's hard to know exactly where to start as a content editor when you're adding content. So where do I go to create? Where's the content, basically? Adding blocks. So yeah, there's a lot of options, like I mentioned. And once you've added a block, you can drag and drop the blocks on the page, which people love to do. But editing the blocks is also a little tricky because there's no edit link. There's a configure link, which seems really like a term designed for site builders. So that being said, the drag and drop is great. And once people figure out where those tools are, they have a good time with it. I'll also mention, before moving on to the paragraphs example, that there are modules to help make the layout builder easier to use. So we think of the layout builder now as like, oh, out of the box, drag and drop page building in Drupal, this is amazing. But I would say if you're using this for a content editor use case, there are some essential modules, which I'll mention in a few minutes, that will just make this experience baseline user-friendly for content editors, just to reduce the options available. Paragraphs, by comparison, it's not, it has a drag and drop component because you can drag and drop things up and down the page. But it doesn't have the same kind of drag and drop feel. Like if you say, you might have heard those ads if you listen to podcasts for Squarespace, where it's like easy drag and drop tools. Easy drag and drop tools. Nobody's thinking of paragraphs. Nobody's thinking of, I can drag and drop a form up and down the page. So the initial kind of idea of like, I have a layout that I can manipulate, you don't get that feeling with paragraphs. However, from a content editor perspective, especially for a content editor who might have used Drupal before, the idea of just editing a form, filling in all the fields, clicking save, this is an easier experience actually to onboard them onto. It's more in line with their paradigm of how Drupal website works. And it's actually fewer clicks because you're not clicking into add section, add block, add custom block, configure the block, click add. There's fewer steps here. You're choosing what kind of paragraph you want to create, and then you're filling in the fields. So here the idea of adding a paragraph, each paragraph becomes a component on the page. Just like in our last example, each custom block there would become a component on the page. So initial impressions are just, okay, this looks like Drupal. It's a big, long form, and I can figure out which paragraphs to add as long as the types are named well to assemble the page. And that's something to emphasize in both these cases. We weren't able to just give content editors Drupal core with layout builder enabled or just with paragraphs installed and say, here you go, build a landing page. In both instances, there's configuration that needs to be done to set up the tools to build the type of landing page that you want. So, creating something that's called full width image or creating something that's called call to action. That is a whole step that's required in either case. So yeah, the paragraphs, just to kind of sum up, like this worked really well for people who are familiar with Drupal content editing, and was faster for them to pick up, even if they hadn't seen paragraphs before. Where this broke down is that we did also try to ask content editors to use paragraphs, but to build something more like a layout. So to say, well, now try and add two things next to each other with paragraphs. In our case, we designed a paragraph that would be like a hierarchical paragraph, which would accept a left column and a right column subparagraph. And for any content editor who hasn't seen that before, it's very confusing. And also means that they can't drag and drop that content to other sections of the page. So using paragraphs to manage layout, definitely not great from the content editor perspective. And finally, we did also do some testing with Gutenberg. So we asked editors in some cases to test out this tool as well, asked them to build the same page. And the initial reaction is very good. So content editors like a design, an admin UI that seems designed for them, that seems to be there for content editors to create content. And just the simplicity of the design is very appealing. But what we found is that the simplicity of the design actually hides a lot of the settings. And so any content editor actually trying to build the landing page to look the way they want, they might not be able to find the setting that they need to adjust what the content component looks like. And the other thing that was interesting is that when you use Gutenberg, and I know probably all of you have heard of it and maybe not all of you have tried it, when you first try it, it looks really appealing because it creates something that looks really nice in the back end. But the problem is that that doesn't look at all like what you get when you publish the content. So the preview looks really nice, but it doesn't look like your website. It's not like a real WYSIWYG experience. which you might be fooled into thinking it is. And so it's not maybe as helpful as it could be. The layout builder, on the contrary, does have some kind of preview that looks a little bit more like your site, but does have still the appearance of an admin UI. And finally, like when you were talking to content editors do appreciate the fact that if they want to build something complex, that there will be more complexity to the UI. So content editors aren't just looking for the simplest tool. They know that they're going to have to learn something if they want to build something powerful. So obviously with Drupal, you can build your own components with paragraphs or with layout builder with block types. And so that gives a lot more leeway to the content editors in the long term. So our takeaways from this testing, you kind of have to think of the content editor workflow. So whatever tool you end up configuring, you kind of have to think from their perspective how they walk through the steps of creating a page. And it's important to keep in mind the fact that, you know, they're maybe working from a design or working from a sketch or working from an idea of the kind of marketing content that they want to create. But they also have to be able to do things like create a draft of the content or change the URL of this page, or maybe update the meta tags. And so depending on what tool you're using and if your form starts to get really complex, some of those details might be lost. So just as you're building whatever you're building, test it and think about it from the content editor perspective. And I found that content editors, I think they think differently than they might, or as we might as people who build websites. So you might think first about placing the content, or maybe you think first about building the layout and then placing the content and then styling the content, like making some of the content left aligned or right aligned or making some heading stand out. So they might be thinking about it differently than you. So you wanna check that. Editors like a layout-oriented editing experience. So they like the idea of the layout builder because they can see where the content's going to be positioned on the page, but they don't necessarily want limitless options. So more options isn't necessarily better if half the options don't look good or aren't really useful for content editing. And the layout builder is complex because it's flexible. So content editors get that. And paragraphs is similar to standard content editing. So it's going to be easier for people to pick up if they know Drupal. But if they don't know Drupal and they're going to have to learn it anyway, the layout builder might just be fine for them to learn. It might just require a little bit more, you know, a couple more screenshots in your documentation and you're good to go. So as somebody putting together the website, you actually have the power to make content editors much happier by customizing whatever page building tools you give them. So whether you decide to go with the paragraphs option or the layout builder option, or maybe you've already picked and you're just going with the flow, it's really important to take the time to do a bit of configuration to help them out. So this is going to help them make better landing pages and help make everything more consistent on the website. So it's a good goal to have. Not including too many options, so not including too many types of blocks or paragraphs is a good idea. I've seen sites that have, 30 paragraph types and 15 of those are just variations on the same thing. So trying to avoid that, maybe having just some settings instead that you configure. Using entities and views reference fields to avoid duplicating content. So if you can give the content editors just a way to reference existing content and you don't have to have them like re-enter the content every time, that's going to help a lot. Limiting the options that you give to editors. So here's where modules, some contributed modules can come in handy. So for the layout building option, for the layout builder option, you want to add the layout builder restrictions module for sure. I think this module is kind of a must. And then the layout builder UX module also provides some added kind of improvements just to the links, the way the links and the buttons appear. There's also a layout builder modal module so that the panel on the right-hand side is not so kind of intrusive. And as you edit things, it's appearing more in a modal kind of pop-up box like you would have when you're editing a view. And this can be a less disorienting experience. And then this one's kind of more subtle. So avoiding site builder oriented terminology. Some of it's kind of baked into the tools. So like with layout builder, the fact that those links say configure, that's obviously a code change. It's not something you can just edit. But just in terms of how you name your paragraphs and blocks, just try and pick things that content editors are going to know and realize. And then finally, whatever tool you pick, like content editors just love the media library. It can take some work to configure media to really work well, and especially if there's a large quantity of media, but taking the time to do that is just going to make the experience better in general. And a lot of times these types of pages do have a lot of visual content. Okay, so which one should we use? I didn't really answer the question yet. Paragraphs versus layout builder. So my instinct says, like, the layout builder is this awesome new tool, and you know, it's been so long, we've been waiting so long for this, go out and use the shiny new thing. So for sure, any site that I'm building from scratch with kind of no restrictions, no other considerations, I'm gonna use the layout builder. But that being said, there are pros and cons, and you have to think about your situation. I know we're here at GovCon, a lot of you work in government or you work on government websites, and you're not starting from scratch, right? Far from it. You have lots of content you've already built up. You have an existing website, or you have a development team you're working with. You're not a solo site owner. And so there's lots of things to take into consideration. So first, with both, you can define block types and paragraph types, and this gives you lots of flexibility. Like, you are actually designing a tool, and that's amazing, but it takes time. So set the time aside. But you're good for both of those. Like, you can create the paragraph types you want. If you're used to using paragraphs and you're switching to layout builder, you know, you can do a lot of the same thing, building custom block types. Paragraphs has fewer clicks to create content. So I know, I know it seems like you might not notice the clicks, but if you watch somebody create the same thing in layout builder and paragraphs, you'll see that layout builder, there's more clicks. Paragraphs is similar to standard content editing, so it's going to be easier to learn, really, for people who know Drupal. And it's less flexible, which I put as a pro, because I'm at heart like a site builder, themer, and I like restrictions, because if you can just build any old layout, it's going to be kind of a mess. Like, if anybody has looked at, well, this is a really old example, but groups.drupal.org, when they introduced panels and anybody could create whatever landing page they wanted for their group, you know, it's just all over the place. Every page is different. So layout builder, on the other hand, like, people do love the drag and drop. So even though it's maybe a learning curve, they're going to be motivated. And one nice thing is that you have then the same approach. You can have the same approach to page building and layout building. So remember when I talked about the recipe at the beginning of the session, the way that you construct what any recipe looks like can be the same for how your landing pages are constructed. And that has a subtle added bonus that then you can also say, well, these 5 recipes are really special, and we can customize the layout of those recipe pages, and then you're using the exact same interface. And so it adds this extra little component of flexibility. And more flexible. So that could be a pro for you if you want to give your marketing team a tool that really has got more options. And it has that third dimension, right, of what a landing page is. The third dimension being the layout, the fact that you can have sections with content that sits side by side. Really, really amazing that we can do this. So on the cons now, let's get realistic. So Paragraphs is not designed to manage layouts. And I'm sure some of you on this call today have worked with nested paragraphs, where the paragraphs kind of model is used to put content into separate columns. And I remember when I first used Paragraphs and I thought, oh, this is so cool, we can have nested paragraphs. and then if you look at actually putting that into place, it can slow down the forms for editing content, and it can be really complicated for content editors to think about, and it's not really designed that way, so your content model gets messy very quickly. It can also be hard to visualize the end product, so you don't really get anything like a WYSIWYG. Even if you have some nice previews turned on, it's still kind of hard to see in your mind's eye, like what's the end result going to be until you hit preview. And you are relying on a contributed module. So remember, Paragraphs is very popular, but it's not in core. So Layout Builder is something dependable that is going to be supported. As Drupal plans for Drupal 10 start to form, then you want to make sure you're using something that's solid. Editing in the UI for Layout Builder is kind of desktop centric. I mean, I guess we could do this on our phones. I'm kind of imagining like Layout Builder is designed to be accessible, so it's possible, but really not optimized. And that might be easier with Layout Builder. And then there's some extra things like, if you actually go to build a landing page in Layout Builder, there's like a different tab for editing the content and editing the layout. And that's tricky for the workflow, especially for if you're not used to that. And you do need these extra modules anyway, these contributed modules, to improve the UX. So I'm in both cases, contributed modules are involved. All right, I've got some important details to share with you. So all of that's great. You've probably already in your mind kind of settled on a preference. Everybody's got an opinion. But whatever route you go, I really want to emphasize the importance of quality. So, so when we start to use tools like Layout Builder, like Paragraphs, and we're building landing pages, we get really excited about all the flexibility that this provides. But we have to come back to the fact that we're using Drupal, which is a content management system that's really good at managing structured content, and that gives us semantic markup, meaning like we know what all the fields are on the page, we know what the header is going to be, that's going to be the H1 of the page. There's a lot of benefits to that. And one of the benefits is that we rely on Drupal for creating these pages that are going to be more accessible than other systems can create, and better out of the box for SEO, because we have a really reliable semantic set of markup. And that means you get all these added benefits, like your content is searchable, and every piece of content on the page kind of has a purpose. So as soon as you use these page building techniques, you don't want to throw all of that away. So you do have to do some planning around what the markup is going to look like on the page and what options you're providing. So one thing I see a lot is just kind of an approach where there's one field for content, and then you can put anything on the page with your paragraphs. Like you can put anything at the top. Same thing with Layout Builder, like, oh, we can take any block and put it anywhere on the page. And that does have some downsides. So you want to make sure that you still have a set of metadata for each piece of content. that you still have a consistent H1 on the page, and that if you're adding these content components using either blocks or paragraphs, that you have consistent headings that are used and that they follow a hierarchy. And then that you actually test the pages that result to make sure that they're accessible. So all things to keep in mind and kind of extra work for you to do as you're making your website more flexible. And then the other big caveat is change management. So I love talking about this. You're building a tool for creating content, right? And so as soon as you switch from one mode of creating content to another, there's a change there just in terms of how people author content on the website. And also maybe if you're moving from one to the other en masse, if you've already created tons of content, there's some kind of migration that you're going to have to do. So, in addition to retraining teams, changing the way that developers are actually working to create new pieces on the site, creating new documentation, doing migration, switching is a big deal. So you want to take that decision very seriously and just plan for all of those changes that are going to have to happen. So there's lots of other resources on this topic, videos, demos, modules you can start to use. One that I'll point out, I really like the Georgia Tech, for those who don't know, the longtime Drupal user. They use Drupal across, I think, maybe 1,000 websites or something like this. So they have some documentation for how they're using layout builder, and it's documentation for people who will be building the sites, people who will be using the different types of blocks. And I really like it because it's a nice guide to just their approach, and also kind of shows you what kind of options you might want to give if you're using the layout builder model. So I recommend that, but all these links could be helpful for you. And I'll post these slides at some point. And just a quick shout out before I'm going to go to the questions in 1 second. We have some upcoming trainings. Evolving Web is giving a upgrading to Drupal 9 training next month. And then in November, we have a complete Drupal training. So it's all online, but it's kind of divided up into different sessions, and we teach site building, theming, module development. So if you want kind of more step-by-step training in Drupal, check that out, evolvingweb.ca/training. And now I'm just going to go and see, because I think I saw something in the chat. And if you have questions.
Yep, there's a few questions, yep.
Great, okay. I will try and.
Are you ready? I can get those for you.
Oh, yes, awesome.
Okay, so there are some really good ones too, some that I actually am curious about as well. How does Paragraph and Layout Builder work with revision?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, when we think about paragraphs, you might have noticed if you've ever downloaded paragraphs that you have to also add this module called entity reference revisions. And so that's like this extra layer just to say say your landing page is going to reference a paragraph, but then the paragraph itself is going to have a revision. So that makes sure that you're pointing to the right revision. So it does track the revisions of the paragraphs just like it would any other kind of content. This can get tricky if you're creating kind of like a content moderation workflow, but in my experience, this works well, and I haven't had to do much customization around that. If you start to display paragraphs content in views though, that can get messy just in terms of how you are able to use those relationships. So that's where that model kind of breaks down. In terms of the layout builder, if you think about the for the page building use case, for the page building use case that we've been talking about, what you're actually doing is creating a whole set of custom blocks. So all those custom blocks are displayed within the layout. And so as you edit them, they kind of have their own revisions. So beyond that, I don't know if there's any kind of caveats. Maybe someone else on the call would know if there's any issues you would run into in terms of managing revisions for a layout builder.
Okay, great. Yeah, if someone has any other comments on that, chime in for sure. We'll move to another question. We're using custom blocks with Layout Builder, but continue to use paragraphs as entity references on custom block types because we aren't able to reference blocks in a custom block type. Is this, I understand the whole nesting thing too, I really do. Is this a best practice or is there a better way?
Okay, so let me explain for those of you who are like, what is that? That's too many things. So imagine I found this use case recently for a university website. So they have all these different kinds of block types that you can use to construct a landing page, like call to action or image or video. And then they have one that's called like stats or something. And so a stat, like a statistic, can have, you might want to add one statistic and then it's got like a, you know, those visuals on a landing page where you have like a big number and then you have a little description underneath. And so you want those two things to be separate fields, but then you want to have a whole set of stats. So you kind of need to have this nesting, like you'd have a reference to a stat and then each stat would have two things. So the question is about like, should you use paragraphs to manage those two fields so that each stat is kind of one paragraph, I guess, and then there's multiple paragraphs, and then the whole stats thing is a block. And so I think the way around this is to start using like custom fields or to use something like a custom entity type. So instead of using instead of using configurable entities like paragraphs, you actually just design your own. And I think that that's a cleaner way to do it if you can, if you have the ability, the kind of programming ability to go and create something custom, especially if you're talking about creating a lot of them, because then, you know, it's just going to mean that you have something that's easier to manage just in terms of the like the data relationships in the future, depending on how you want to use it, like in views or whatever. I think it's going to be more consistent.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. Okay, did you use Paragraph's layout module?
I haven't not used this module, but I think it's this module where you can, like the preview actually looks like when you're editing, it actually looks more like a layout. Is that what this module is?
I am not sure either, and I've worked with Paragraphs a lot. It looks like, yeah.
I have it like somewhere in the back of my mind. I'm like, I know what this is. I've seen the module page, but I don't.
It says Flexbox based layout system for Paragraphs. So
yeah.
like a layout system specifically for Paragraphs. That's interesting.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And I think it definitely comes back to this point where like content editors, they really want to see what it's going to look like. They want that preview. I tried out Craft CMS a couple of years ago, and they have a preview that's just built in. Like you have your form on the left, and then on the right, you kind of see what it looks like as you're building it. And I think people really love this. But I think it can be kind of hard to pull off and make it really consistent. It seems like the amount of work that the layout builder folks had to do to create the layout builder interface, like I'm sure if you started using this module, it might work really well in some use cases and not in others. So I have to test it out.
Okay, and this one is a good one. I've worked with panels quite a bit too. How do these compare, compete, or enhance with panels?
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, panels has been around for so long. Like, I think the first Drupal camp presentation I did in 2008 was about panels. And so, like, this problem of how do we manage layouts and do page building has been around since then. And actually now all of these modules are built on this layout UI module, which has been in core for a while. And so there's actually some commonalities just between how Layout Builder manages its layouts and how Panels does. And if you, in your theme, for example, wanted to add a new kind of layout, you would do that and it would work with both. That being said, because Layout Builder is in core and there's this momentum behind it, I have not been using Panels since Drupal 8 came out. So I'm not really sure at this point what its differentiators are and what role it plays in this ecosystem.
Okay. All right. Well, let's see. We've got another session starting here real soon. Any other questions from anyone? This was a very good talk. I haven't done anything with Layout Builder in probably 3 years, so this has come a long ways. This is great to see.
Yeah, for sure. So that's your homework. Go check it out.
All right.
Great. Thanks for everyone. It was really fun, and see you around.
Yeah, thank you so much.
GrubCon.